Good morning to our viewers here in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual discussion. Early this week, G7 leaders met in the Bavarian Alps for the first big international event hosted by Olaf Scholz in Germany since he took over from Angela Merkel as chancellor. And later in the week, the NATO Summit took place in Madrid. In both cases, there was a strong show of solidarity, but what did these summits actually achieve? For a readout on the G7 and NATO summits, I'm delighted to welcome Fabian Reinbold and Andrea Shalal. Both of them were on the ground and covering the summits. Fabian is a political journalist for T-Online in Berlin and previously served as White House correspondent in Washington. Fabian, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having us.
Delighted to have you. And Andrea is senior correspondent for Reuters based in Washington. Before that, she was based in Berlin and reported on foreign policy, security, and defense policy. Andrea, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
With the two of you, it really seems like there's a little bit of a role reversal, or at least a location reversal, having relatively recently swapped cities to have the German in Germany makes sense and the American in America, but each of you have tremendous reporting experience from the other side of the Atlantic. So I'm sure that will provide some great insights for our conversation today. So before we dive in and actually talk about the results of the summits and sort of the takeaways of the summits, I'd like to ask you both a little bit about the atmospherics, particularly in Elmau. Andrea, you had the opportunity to be back in Germany for the first time in a while. What was the mood like in Elmau on the periphery of the summit? What did you pick up that we might not have read about in all of the reporting on the summits?
Well, it's really interesting because it's such a picturesque setting. I mean, it couldn't be any more beautiful. And we had, in fact, we had fabulous weather, which was great for most of it, a little bit of rain on the end. But what you couldn't see on all those beautiful television pictures is just the enormous police presence that was there. And I think we have to remember that Olaf Scholz was the mayor of Hamburg when the G20 summit took place. And there was a lot of violence and there was a lot of chaos. And so it's pretty clear that Scholz gave very clear directions to not have a recurrence. So there were 18,000 police officers brought in from all over Germany. And you couldn't see them on the TV pictures, but we sure saw them. The journalists saw them because there were road closures. So it was just an incredibly difficult thing for people to actually be there to cover it on the ground. And there were two media centers. One was in Garmisch, sort of and then one was right up at the Schloss. It took a lot of hurdles and a lot of security to get through that. So that was a little bit of the atmospherics. And, I will say that Garmisch, the folks in Garmisch were pretty frustrated because their city was essentially shut down. And, so the normal tourism wasn't happening and the journalists were working around the clock. So probably not imbibing and eating as much in the establishments, just to set the stage a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And Fabian, what about for you? What was your experience like? How did you find the atmosphere? What struck you?
Yeah, at some point, the mood was almost schizophrenic, I would say, because of, like Andrea said, it was so idyllic up there in the Alps. It was so picturesque, and you could almost, at certain points, you could almost forget how challenging the times we live in have become for those meeting there, have become for us covering it. And so that was sort of the continuous feeling throughout the days. And I think it's important what Andrea said. The folks down there were really frustrated by the summit. And I was surprised by that, actually, how much frustration there was. You saw a lot of anti-G7 billboards in the city on official storefronts. That was really a surprise for me. And I talked to one of Scholz's organizers, And well, they will not have a summit in Elmo again. That was pretty clear from what he told me.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting.
Steve, I just want to mention that when we arrived in Munich, there was a huge welcoming ceremony. And Markus Söder had brought out, this welcoming committee of all these people in Trachten, in traditional German dress, so lederhosen and dirndl, and there was music playing, and it was just, when Air Force One arrived, they were still rolling out the red carpet, which was just about done as the president sort of disembarked, and there was this thing, and Twitter was crazy. I sort of tweeted out a couple of pictures, and Twitter went crazy. They're like, "What is this desk? Did they give him a desk? Why did they give him a desk on the tarmac?" But in fact, he was signing the Golden Guest Book, and it was quite a display. It was just interesting. We were thinking about what the consequences would have been if Söder would be, part of the federal government now, would be leading the federal government, which was, of course, a possibility during the previous election. So it was just an interesting time to reflect on how the atmosphere might have been a little different. But I did think it was interesting that, Scholz let Söder have that moment instead of, kind of staging that himself. It was a very Bavarian moment. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, to hear both of you talk, to go from sort of these two extremes, right? The pomp and circumstance of President Biden's arrival and the very strong Bavarian flavor, if you will, that had, and then sort of at the other end, some of these protests. I did actually want to ask you a little bit about sort of some of the protests and how some of the observers felt about the G7 summit, because on a report that I had heard this week about on Deutschlandradio, a couple of people were quoted as saying, this is an imperialist meeting, and we don't think that this makes sense. Not to mention just the disruption for people who live locally, and yet, nothing really made it into the news that there were significant protests. So it sounds as if there was some sort of frustration directed at the G7 world leaders, but that it didn't really manifest itself. Fabian, did you sort of take anything away related to that?
The protests were much smaller than people had expected. That was a surprise for myself as well. I'm still not sure as to why exactly. There's a lot of speculation that somehow, persistent narratives have sort of begun to change or evolve a bit in this year. That maybe for some who have viewed America and the G7 as imperialistic forces, quote unquote, maybe now there's a different actor who is more obvious an imperialistic force. So I think that has contributed. I think some people have not made the trip, have rather focused, some protesters have focused on Madrid rather than G7. But like Andrea said, for Scholz, this was very important, very, very important after Hamburg 2017, that the whole protest situation did not escalate. And it did not. At some point, they carried, I think, 50 protesters or so within viewing distance of the castle, to sort of, so they could be carried into the perimeter, could sort of see the castle, but leaders themselves did not see those protests.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting, Steve, too. I think the atmosphere, and I think this was a deliberate, just to continue going on along the contrast. So there was really an attempt to create an environment for conversation. And now, the glimpses that we caught, whether it was the tops of, the beginning of the bilateral meetings or the group photos, there was clearly an effort made to facilitate a little bit of camaraderie. And, I point you to the photo shoot at the bench made famous by the Obama-Merkel picture, where Obama is sitting on the bench with his arms on the bench, looking at the golden, this Alpengrün, the golden Alps, and Merkel is standing there in front of him. And it was just a really touching and joyous moment that kind of underscored the strength of the relationship that they had. And the leaders wanted to have a photograph again in this beautiful, really incredibly breathtaking spot. And but they had been having dinner, and so they were a little soused. I mean, we were. It really looked like they'd had quite a bit of wine with dinner, and they came out. They sort of spilled out, and then, staged themselves along this bench. But what was evident there was, a real sense of working together. So they were, it was a lighter moment. It wasn't as formal as the regular family photos, but, Justin Trudeau had his arm around the Japanese Prime Minister, and Boris Johnson, and, Biden was standing very close to Ursula von der Leyen. And it was a kind of authentic moment. It was staged. Obviously they were trying to stage it, but just the atmosphere that you saw. And the American press, we kept asking the president, but also the people who were traveling with him, whether the Supreme Court ruling that we had on Friday, just before he left, which is, sent shockwaves through the United States, certainly the progressive camp, whether that was the topic of discussion. And he kept saying, and they kept saying that no, but you did kind of have the impression that so many of these leaders came there a little bit weakened domestically. So it might have been a little bit of a respite from domestic woes to focus on the big picture.
I certainly think for Biden, domestic politics must have overshadowed this foray onto the international stage, and even thinking about someone like Emmanuel Macron and his recent election, that domestic issues, did play a role for them. But of course, both of these summits provided the opportunity for world leaders to show strong unity in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine. And I think both summits came across that way. But let's talk a little bit about some of the main takeaways from the G7 summit. Fabian, do you want to go first and sort of give us your sort of top level takeaways?
Sure. Well, in my view, the G7 summit was, it had a strong performance aspect to it. So it had a lot of show effects. I think a little less on substance when it comes to concrete results. I think for me, the predominant feeling was you could grasp the typical aspiration of the G7 countries to shape and influence the world according to our values, according to our interests. But at the same time, it was so obvious, these sort of doubts. Do we still have the power to do so at this pivotal moment? And this need to reach out to other actors, such as the countries that Scholz invited to the summit, like, for instance, India was an important guest nation. And you could see how all the leaders were courting India's Prime Minister Modi, because they all know how much they need him. And you could feel it, and you could see it in the summit, where leaders spend a lot of time, or their Sherpas, to be specific, spend a lot of time discussing the US proposal for price caps on Russian energy, for instance. And, we didn't come to a conclusion there. This is postponed for the time being, but everybody knew that in order for a price cap to work, you need India's Modi on board, because he's the one who's now the big importer of discounted Russian oil that we in Germany don't want anymore.
Mm-hmm. And Andrea, what about for you?
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I mean, I think the unity of message about Russia was quite important. There were also very strong statements about China. Those statements are getting stronger and stronger over time. You'll recall that, there's been kind of building frustration, and you see it, we saw it both at the G7, but then also at the NATO Summit, that is a definite and clear subtext. And I think the Biden administration is trying very hard to link those two and to talk about the convergence, the relationship between China and Russia, and to make it very clear that that is a threat to Western democracies and Western democratic systems. It's a persistent theme for Joe Biden. It's something that he brings up over and over and over again. And he knows these leaders. He knows Putin. He knows Xi. And, he will remind you in a heartbeat about their very different perspectives on how our society should function. Exhibit A is Ukraine, but clearly there's a lot of concern, as the Ukrainian president told the assembled G7 and other leaders there. This isn't just about Ukraine. And so I think everyone is very mindful of that, I would say. And I think, that was the intention. That was the hope, that they would come out with that. I think they wish that they'd gotten a little bit further on the oil price cap. The infrastructure, the revived, relaunched, Build Back Better World, now called something else, is was another one of those efforts that is also focused squarely at China. And there was a lot of interesting color behind the scenes there. I think the Americans really drove the train on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seemed like there was a strong American agenda. I mean, if one's fair to Germany's presidency in January, the priorities for the G7 summit and for its year as president of the G7 looked very different. But obviously, the war in Ukraine has totally overshadowed a lot of those issues. And I'm happy to hear both of you talk about kind of the role that China played in the G7, but also in the NATO discussions, because I think China had been a topic of great importance on the G7 agenda prior to the war in Ukraine. It was maybe pushed to the back burner a little bit in light of the war in Ukraine. And yet it's certainly a topic that was high on the agenda in at least some of the deliberations. But what about, sort of particularly in the G7 context, what about issues like global inflation or some of the concerns about food security, also exacerbated through the war in Ukraine? And even, Olaf Scholz's climate club. I mean, these seem to be areas that definitely occupied, some discussion, but where there wasn't necessarily anything really tangible that came out of the meeting. Andrea, you were nodding, so perhaps you go first, and then Fabian.
I mean, I went expecting there to be a lot more discussion about inflation and the economic factors. Now, they did have a consultation with the leaders of multilateral organizations. I mean, and then they did a family photo, and I was thinking, like, wow, this is such an elite club of the people who are running really the global economy. You had Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization. You had Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. You had, Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization. I mean, David Malpass, the President of the World Bank. Everybody was there. And there is a lot going on the multilateral stage in terms of both continuing to deal with the pandemic, preparing for the next pandemic. The World Bank just approved its pandemic preparation fund that will start to put some money toward getting ready for the next pandemic. But the the topics that we hear about so much here in Washington might have been discussed. We just didn't really, it didn't flow out to the outside as much. I don't know about you, Fabian. Did you get those messages too? It's interesting, actually, because Scholz was the former finance minister.
Right.
So it's not like he's not, he definitely is very attuned to it, but it wasn't like it didn't dominate the headlines.
Yeah, absolutely. I was surprised too, but also his people were telling us before the event that they would not put so much effort onto this issue because they want to, they sort of said, we got to show some restraint. It's also an issue that the central banks have to deal with and stuff like that. But it was surprising. And it was also surprising that, or maybe not surprising, but I think was noteworthy that, as you mentioned on food security, I mean, this is such a potentially huge crisis for the whole world. And yes, they pledged funds. They pledged 4.3 billion euros. Yeah, $4.5 billion was it? To strengthen food security. But I was left wondering, okay, what are they actually going to do about it? Because when it came to the question of getting the grain out of Ukraine, they mostly stuck to, an old appeal to Russia to open up the Black Sea for the grain to be able to be exported. And I mean, this clearly is not enough to resolve this imminent crisis. And I think it's an issue where people expected more progress. I know it's a terribly difficult issue to resolve. That I think that's clear to everybody, but I don't think it will be solved. I'm sure it can't be solved by only pledging a sum of money. And as for the climate club, finally, it was such a heavy priority for Scholz's people. I remember back in January when we had the first briefing about the G7 presidency, it was their top priority. And the German government spent a lot of political capital, spent a lot of time on getting this club to take off, so to speak. And I think this is only it's only there halfway. They said they would institute the club by the end of the year, but the most important issue, and that's pricing for CO2. This is so difficult. This is not easily achieved with America. This is not easily achieved with Japan, for example. And I don't think we've seen a lot of progress on that front.
So let me fold in a viewer question. Somebody just submitted a question that reads as follows. Given the problems of inflation and rising oil prices, did the potential of an agreement with Iran and oil imports from Iran come up in any of the conversations that you might be aware of? And the same is true for Venezuela. Were Iran and Venezuela on the agenda in discussions that you heard about?
But just before Biden left, or just as Biden was leaving for Europe, a couple of senior Biden administration folks headed to Venezuela, to Caracas, both to try to free an American being held there, but also to work on the production piece. Biden, as you know, is going to be heading to the Middle East. Iran will be very, very central to those discussions, both in Israel and Saudi. There, the point of the trip is to work on oil production questions with the Saudis and the Gulf Cooperation Council, all the members, but also Iran is clearly a very large piece of that puzzle. I think it was probably a tangential. It was like an underlying question and concern. Obviously, oil production in general has to go up if to offset the going to bring prices lower. But I think the Iran issue is something that is being worked in very separate and distinct talks. It has a very different track. We expected that Iran to be the sort of main talking point when the leaders the Quad leaders got together. So the United States, France, Germany, and Britain. And then at the last minute, that was our understanding was that Iran was going to be a very central topic. But then at the last minute, Mario Draghi was added to the meeting. And it was a little puzzling, why that happened at the last minute. But I don't know about you, Fabian, but I mean, Iran was not something that we were briefed about on the sidelines an awful lot. And I think it's because it is so complex, but also because the president is now going to the Middle East. And so, everyone took notice of that, I would say, and and they are still in the preparations for that trip in 2 weeks.
Same on the German side of things. It was not a prominent topic in the briefings we had and discussions we had.
So Fabian, a little bit earlier, you talked a little bit about the partner countries that were in attendance at the G7, India, South Africa, Argentina, Indonesia, Senegal. And Andrea, you were talking about the sort of 2.0 version of Build Back Better World, which is now called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And I wanted to ask both of you sort of about the Global South and the role or the degree to which conversations evolved around sort of supporting, bringing along the Global South, particularly given how much we've been hearing lately about sort of a either lack of support from countries in the Global South, but also how some countries are kind of standing on the sidelines with regard to the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, this comes after they've been, in some cases, just very disappointed at not getting vaccines in the response to the pandemic. So at the G7, how much of a role did relations with the Global South play? Fabian, maybe you first, and then Andrea.
Yeah, for Scholz, this is really a central issue. It's really a cornerstone of his emerging foreign policy, or of his emerging outlook onto the world, so to speak. He talks so much. It's not something that makes a lot of headlines, sure. But when you talk to him, he talks so much about these democracies of the future, as he calls them. So he thinks a lot about actors like Indonesia, like South Africa, like India. He's been mentioning them from the very start of his tenure. And for him, these countries are important allies in this sort of grand power struggle between democracy and autocracy that has begun to play out. And so he spent a lot of effort on courting them and on engaging them. And he knows that they can't be swayed easily into taking a stronger position in the Russia-Ukraine war, for example. I think they are pretty realistic about that. But his agenda is to engage them, is to show them that we are at least equally, if not more, interested than China or Russia in doing business with them, in aligning ourselves with them. And so for me, the second day at the summit was really typical for his approach. As for the prospects for success, Scholz went to Africa in May, which is really early in his tenure. He went to Senegal, among other places, and his people were really happy about how that visit went, and they had the impression that they made some pretty strong arguments to the president, Macky Sall, and they were pretty confident after leaving there. But then what happened after that was Macky Sall flew to Russia and met President Putin in Sochi, and stood side by side with Putin and sort of embraced, to a certain extent, Putin's narrative that the whole that the whole wheat crisis is partly caused by Western sanctions and not by Putin's actions. So you really see the challenges in this policy in this little example.
I mean, I think I just want to jump in there. So the sanctions don't apply to wheat. I mean, it is just a false argument to say that the sanctions are causing these problems. Clearly, the problem is caused by the blockaded ability of Ukraine to transfer out grain. And, you know, on the energy front, you know, Russia says there are maintenance problems with Nord Stream 1, but in fact, US intelligence, officials and European ones are convinced that it's really just an excuse, this maintenance problem, so that the price of, they're trying to drive the price of gas higher, and to punish the West for its response. So, I mean, I was in touch with a number of NGOs during the course of these summits, and particularly the G7 one, and I think there is, it's always difficult. Like they appreciate the effort that is there. $4.3 billion is nothing to sneeze at. But, we have a looming debt crisis. Sometime during the summit period spoke with the outgoing World Bank economist, Carmen Reinhardt, who's kind of one of the world's foremost experts on debt and debt crises. And, there are so many countries now and so many, more countries that are in debt distress. And China has been incredibly unconstructive in terms of working forward on these things. So the G20 together, China is a member of the G20, together with the Paris Club of Official Creditors, set up this framework for debt restructuring in the fall of 2020, so very early on in the pandemic, because international leaders, the IMF, the World Bank, and others were warning that this, the pandemic would greatly exacerbate the problems. What you have now is that the war has exacerbated those issues that were already there for those countries tremendously. And many of them are dependent on imports of fuel. A few have actually benefited from rising fuel prices, but many are also highly dependent on the imports of grains. So I think the warning bells are ringing as far as they continue, as far as the future for the developing world. And I would say that the leaders that were assembled there at the G7 are very cognizant of that. You'll see a lot more discussion about this in about 2 weeks' time when the G20 meet in Indonesia, because the finance ministers tend to take the lead on these things. And then all of those finance ministers are working on food security and debt issues as well, and also continuing to address the pandemics. We will see more about that. And then you'll see the G20 leaders, I think, embrace that and pick it up a little bit more in November when they meet in Indonesia. And just finally, I will say, so there's always this push-pull of like being happy about something. I mean, $600 billion worth of proposed and planned investment in infrastructure across the developing world is really a large amount of money that is not straight, transfers. What that is leveraging private investment and trying to ensure that more private investment goes into places that haven't seen that kind of investment. And, what people told us behind the scenes is that they are pretty confident that this increased Western interest in investing in these places will make a difference, because the Chinese investment has not been very helpful to them. So you've seen, roads and structures built, but they bring in Chinese workers. And so the local workers don't benefit from the jobs that are created in the building of this infrastructure. And the agreements that have been signed with these countries are incredibly opaque. They include confidentiality clauses, non-disclosure agreements, and also collateralized loan agreements. So if a country then gets into distress, shouldn't be borrowing that much money in the first place. But if it does get into distress, also at much, much higher, really predatory interest rates, China will assume control over these ports, bridges, highways, and other major infrastructure projects. And the Western nations, pledged in this renewed effort to have a much different and much more transparent approach. So those things, the problem is that's not like it's not a quick bang for your buck kind of thing. You don't get an immediate result. It's going to take some time.
Mm-hmm. So let's thank you both for that. But let's switch gears and turn to the NATO summit for just a few minutes in specific. I mean, in many ways, this summit was described as historic because the pave is pathed for Sweden and Finland to join NATO now that Turkey has agreed to lift its veto. The leaders at the summit endorsed a new NATO strategic concept. This is perhaps not as historic, but it's an important blueprint for the alliance to navigate, a more dangerous world, if you will. And it, addressed NATO's approach to Russia, but also other threats like terrorism, cybersecurity, hybrid war, and of course, and this was somewhat groundbreaking. It really took head on some of the challenges that are posed by China. So, Andrea, you were in Madrid for the NATO summit as well. What were sort of your takeaways from what you saw there on stage, but also what you were able to see sort of on the periphery?
I think there was really a sense of it being a historic moment, and I think there was a huge amount of relief that Turkey lifted its veto, that was able to happen, because we were being guided and counseled as we were heading there that we should not expect that there would be some incremental progress, and that they'd be in a better position, but that we shouldn't expect that the invitation would actually be offered to Sweden and Finland to join, because it was unclear to everyone, including the US delegation, how much progress they would make with Turkey. And we were all caught by surprise. I think that key members of the Biden administration were actually out and about in Madrid at the time that all sort of came together, and it was kind of a mad scramble to respond quickly, which they did. I'll tell you that they called a background briefing with 5 minutes notice.
Wow.
Which is unusual. So
yeah.
It was sort of like, get on the phone now. And so I think there was a huge amount of relief about that. And they were really insistent that there hadn't been a quid pro quo, but it was, of course, notable that it was very clear then that Turkey, that the US would move forward with the process of selling Turkey more modern and updated F-16s. For the viewers who aren't aware, Turkey was an initial partner in the F-35 program, quite a significant player, and got booted out when it decided to buy an S-400 Russian-built missile defense system. And the US is really holding firm on that. But these F-16s are a little, they're not as capable. And so the F-16s, though, will certainly help Turkey play in an important role in the air defense of the NATO alliance.
Mm-hmm. Fabian, do you have anything to add?
I just want to add the importance of Finland joining NATO. I think it can easily be forgotten because we sort of expected it to happen for a while now. But I think that on the one hand, there's the sheer geopolitical impact. Finland has a 1,300 kilometer land border with Russia. So this is a whole new eastern flank for NATO, which is going to be very, very interesting. And also symbolically, I mean, in Europe, Finlandization has always been a big concept in foreign policy discourse, meaning that a country such as Finland is sort of part of Europe, but will remain completely neutral and a bit deferential to a big neighbor such as Russia. That was also always a big concept in German politics and German politicians talking about how to align the country. And now, I mean, Putin was hoping for a sort of Finlandization of Europe in his policies. And now we really see a complete opposite of that happening. So I think that's really, really important. And it's sort of a, to use a famous expression by our chancellor, it's really like a Zeitenwende moment for NATO there as well.
I do think one can't underestimate the importance of having Finland and Sweden as part of the NATO club, if you will. But it's also interesting to see how, as Andrea was talking about, Turkey really was able to kind of take advantage of the situation and get some concessions in the process. And one of our viewers is curious as to what the consequences might be for Kurds who are living in Sweden and Finland. Fabian, you're nodding your head. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that off the bat. I know that wasn't sort of one of the topics that we said we were going to talk about today, but it is an interesting corollary question, if you will.
Oh, and it's a hugely important issue, of course. I'm not sure if I can answer it. The language between Turkey and the two countries is very vague when it comes to the Kurdish question and extraditions and fighting terrorism. It's vague. It's usually, that's how these things usually work. So these agreements are vague so that everybody can see themselves as a winner. I think regarding to this question, we don't know yet. We don't know yet the effects this deal is going to have. But I do want to remind everyone that although we celebrate the results now, these things have to be ratified by all 30 countries, by the parliaments in every country. And I'm really wondering what Erdogan and his friends from the AKP might still come up with before they will actually ratify the two countries joining it. So I think we haven't seen the end of it yet.
Yeah, it's the beginning of a long process.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was only yesterday, really just basically on the very heels of the agreement that Erdogan made clear that they could still pull out and then they could still change their mind. And, given Turkey's, given the history of Turkey and its behavior in international, on the international arena, I think that's a very serious prospect that, having kind of moved forward, there could still be steps backward. And as far as the Kurds in Sweden, my colleague Simon Johnson in Stockholm spoke with a lot of Kurds in the diaspora there, and they are very, very worried that they will become a pawn in this, and that there's about 100,000 Kurds in Sweden, and Sweden has been very supportive. The Kurds have been basically fighting for, the PKK has been fighting for independence and rights since 1984. It's a very long ongoing struggle. And there's a lot of solidarity between other indigenous populations so there's a strong linkage with Palestinians and the Kurds. I think it certainly is a danger that there could be, we'll see a more aggressive prosecution of Kurds. And, Turkey has long insisted on extradition of people, which countries in Western Europe, by and large, have resisted. But if Erdogan has this leverage to say, well, I'll just, I won't agree to Finland and Sweden joining, or to Sweden in particular, joining, it could give him a lot more power in that relationship and those negotiations.
During the course of our conversation, China has come up a couple of times, and of course, it's an undercurrent and a recurring theme. One of our viewers submitted the following question. She writes, both the G7 and NATO communiques took an incrementally harder line on China on issues like human rights and economic policies. But apart from the G7 plan to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, actual actions against China seem limited. Is this a deliberate attempt to not alienate China and push China further into the arms of Russia, given that especially in the NATO statement, Russia is now the biggest strategic threat? Any thoughts on how the West, both in the G7 format and the NATO format, are kind of walking a fine line vis-a-vis relations with China? Fabian, you're nodding your head, so maybe you first and then Andrea.
Nodding my head too much, I'm afraid. But I can take the question. Sure. I think that's part of the answer. This looming Russian-Chinese alliance is really spooking a lot of people in the Western governments, rightly so, I think. Mm-hmm. But we must also not forget that maybe there's no such thing as the West when it comes to China, or let me rephrase that. There's a lot of different views on China within the alliance, within the G7 and within NATO. And you could see it play out in the summits when it came to negotiate about the language. I think countries as America and Great Britain wanted to see tougher language on China, emphasizing China as a threat, as a competitor, whereas countries such as Germany, but also France, wanted to emphasize more the partner aspect in the relationship to China. I think it's not a new conflict between our countries, but it is still continuing to play out. And I think at the moment it's very interesting to see the German debate on China is taking shape, is becoming more prominent. We are working on a national strategy on how to deal with China. And you can also see in the recent weeks, a lot of business leaders actually speak out and talk about China and our China policy. I think that shows us that there's a lot of doubt and concern where the German China policy is heading. And I think Germany in this context of the two summits was more a force of restraint when it came to the China language. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you see it, Andrea, from the American.
And now Andrea's nodding her head, so we'll go to her next.
So we watched that debate unfold behind the scenes, and in the end, I mean, it is significant. This is the first strategic concept issued since 2010, and for the first time, it mentions China. Just 5, 6, 7 years ago, talking about China in these terms would have really rocked the boat. And now you have the 30 countries in NATO, not just the G7, 30 countries in NATO are talking about seeing China as a systemic challenge. And I think, I do think that that's significant. I think it is to be seen as separate from the economic relationship. Now, there was a lot of talk about decoupling, especially under the Trump administration, because the Trump administration engaged in this very aggressive trade war with China. President Biden is considering rolling back some of those tariffs. Many of those tariffs were applied to Chinese goods that have absolutely no strategic value. The former Sherpa, Dilip Singh, who's now gone to a job on Wall Street, but he he talked sort of about underwear and bicycles, like what is the strategic value of, putting tariffs on that? It just punishes consumers. So I think here in the United States, President Biden is walking a very fine line, to use your term, between, rolling back tariffs that were nonsensical and non-strategic in hopes of getting a little bit of relief on the inflation front, but at the same time, continuing to underscore the security concerns. And it is true that the U.S. has said, and U.S. officials have told us over and over again, that they have not seen widespread circumvention of the sanctions on Russia by China, or for that matter, India. I mean, they are countries that are still doing business with Russia are being very careful to not get into this, ensnared by the U.S. or Western sanctions. So, and if that were to happen, the U.S. has been very clear that they will go after any Chinese companies or entities, state-owned or otherwise, that are, helping Russia basically backfill its needs. So I think we're at a point where it's a balancing act, right? The global economy is incredibly interconnected, and it is not possible, at least at this point, to completely decouple. But there is a completely new, and many U.S. companies, Intel, other companies, are still very heavily invested in producing in China. As and this is certainly true in Germany. I think I just read that Germany is, building a new semiconductor factory in China. That's okay from the American standpoint. They're not worried about the economic piece, as long as there's a check on it. And all of these countries in the G7 particularly are, realizing that they have to do more to promote their own domestic production of critical components, such as semiconductors.
So we started our conversation today with sort of some personal takes from each of you on the atmospherics and the mood in Elmau. And I'd like to maybe draw it to a close by talking a little bit about leadership and how President Joe Biden, but Chancellor Olaf Scholz sort of really came across in these different settings. Andrea, you mentioned earlier that domestic issues sort of overshadowed certainly some of the press conferences with Joe Biden, and there is obviously a lot going on at home that he had to deal with. So perhaps spending some time abroad was a little bit of a relief for him. But how did Joe Biden sort of come across balancing some of these global challenges with some of the domestic challenges he faces, particularly in the run-up to the midterms?
You know what the previous press secretary always used to say, that Biden could, the Biden administration could walk and chew gum at the same time. But I think, we couldn't draw President Biden on the domestic issues until the very last day, when he did announce his support for a partial carve out of the filibuster on the Roe v. Wade decision. I would say that Biden, basically set aside the domestic issues for the most part, with the exception of the economic ones, which are obviously front and center to the thing. So I think, overall, I guess you could say that, they got what they wanted. They came, they got what they wanted. And certainly the relationship with Germany is a lot better than it was. So that was probably a pretty big goal too, was to ensure that relationship continued to stabilize and become stronger.
And Fabian, for you, the G7 sort of started with a couple of bilateral conversations between Biden and Scholz, and Justin Trudeau and Scholz, both of whom were very positive about Scholz and about German leadership, sort of setting the stage for the G7, but then also for NATO. What's Scholz's standing domestically coming out of these two summits, and did he come across as a strong world leader?
Yeah, I think for him, it was a very important stage to be on, because doubts about his leadership or his ability to lead have been circulating from the very start of his administration. I think that this praise by President Joe Biden, especially, that was very, very important for Scholz. I also happen to know, because I tweeted praise, of course, as I was standing next to them, and you could really just see members of Scholz's SPD like retweeting that phrase. You've done an incredible job, is what Biden told Scholz. So a lot of people took some pride or relief in hearing that. I think in the summit itself, Scholz did not really come across as the leader, more as a good supporting actor. And of course, he always faced that comparison to Merkel, because it was on the very same spot 7 years earlier that Merkel really showed leadership and had this famous picture that Andrea already talked about. Mm-hmm. So this was always the comparison. And I think in this comparison, he did not come across as a leader, but it helped him, I think, domestically. And domestically, he's in a tough spot. I mean, his coalition is facing a lot of disagreements at the moment. His own party, and himself included, are losing trust in the polls. The Greens are soaring in the polls, and Germany is heading into a tough fall. Now, we're still in summer. We can sort of look the other way, but the gas crisis is looming. All the conflicts in the coalition are looming. So I think the fall will be a very tough time domestically for Scholz.
Mm-hmm. In this sense, I think there are some real parallels between where Biden and Scholz are, as Andrea knows, because we had a conversation about this about a week ago. I do think that there are some parallels between the two of them in terms of some of the challenges that they face at home, and this was even prior to the current spate of challenges, if you will. They also both sort of have a somewhat similar background in terms of coming, from in their established careers, sort of from centrist parts of their respective parties. But it's going to be interesting to see how each of them navigates the coming domestic challenges in the weeks and months ahead, and then also how they address the ongoing global challenges, because certainly the war in Ukraine is not going to end soon and is going to continue to be a dawa tema, as of course COVID is as well, which we haven't even really talked about. And who knows what else might come next. So I would just like to thank both of you tremendously for taking the time to have this conversation. I thought it was really interesting, and obviously, as we've discussed over the course of the last hour and here at the end, there are lots of other topics that will be coming up in the weeks and months ahead. And I hope that we can draw on you both for some of those upcoming discussions. But for now, thanks for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend.